Hello and welcome to the second installment of the American Friend of Jamaica series, A Conversation With. I am Paula Campbell Roberts, a U.S. consumer economist at KKR, a global private equity firm, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. I'm joined by Richard Biles, the governor of the Bank of Jamaica, and Peter Blair Henry, professor and dean emeritus at NYU Stern School of Business. Today's topic will be focused on how will the economy recover after the global pandemic. I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Richard Biles, who has served the country of Jamaica in public and private sectors within several senior management positions over a 40-year-long career. He is currently serving as the governor of the Bank of Jamaica, having been appointed on August 19, 2019. Before taking on this role, he served at the helm of Sagicor Group Jamaica Limited as chairman after a 13-year-long career as both president and CEO. Prior to this position, he was the president of Panjam Investment Limited. I would also like to welcome Mr. Peter Blair Henry, an economist, professor, and the 9th dean of the New York University Leonard S. Stern School of Business. Peter is also the author of Turnaround, Third World Lessons for First World Growth. Prior to teaching at NYU, he was also a professor of international economics at Stanford University. In 2008 and 2009, Peter served in President Barack Obama's presidential committee in reviewing international lending agencies. He then went on to be appointed to the President's Commission on White House Fellowships. He is currently serving on the board of directors of the National Bureau of Economic Research, Citigroup, and Nike. I'm honored to be with you both today. From my seat investing in companies and asset classes around the world, during this pandemic, our firm has been impressed by the record levels of monetary and fiscal stimulus, which has stabilized markets. But I, along with Henry McVeigh, who I know is listening in, am closely monitoring the likely long-term impact of high levels of government and corporate debt, high levels of unemployment, as well as the shifts in consumer and business behavior that have implications for our investments. Amidst these massive changes underfoot, from your perspective, Richard, what are the core development challenges resulting from the pandemic, and what key steps should business, finance, and the government take to address these challenges?
Thank you, Paula. May I say what a pleasure it is to be here with you and Peter. Peter is one of our distinguished Jamaicans abroad, and we certainly appreciate his contribution. Let me give you a little background. Before COVID struck us all in March of this year, Jamaica had come a long way in correcting our fiscal imbalances. We had got to a point of about 94% debt to GDP, which is coming all the way from 145% in 2013. And indeed, we had also built a fiscal buffer of about 4% of GDP. So if you want to call that a savings account that we had built up. We had also, over the last 7 years, done very significant structural reforms, especially in the area of taxes and doing business with government. We had strengthened the financial sector, made sure that it was properly capitalized and very stable, lowered inflation to between 4 to 6%, and built up foreign exchange buffer, net international reserves of about 2.7 billion. And we had experienced 18 consecutive quarters of positive growth in GDP. Then comes COVID. And the outlook is that GDP will contract by about 7 to 10%, maybe even a little bit more, because as you know, we've had some severe flooding in the last couple of weeks. Unemployment has grown to 12.6% from 7.8, the 7.8 being an all-time high in Jamaica's recorded economic history. And we are going to run a current account deficit of about 5%, which is double what we had before. So how are we trying to get ourselves out of this predicament? We're using monetary and fiscal policy to try to support the economy until the economy can get back on track on its own. The Minister of Finance, for example, has put about 4% of GDP as social welfare into the economy. And this is a significant contribution by us, bearing in mind that we're a country with a high debt burden. BOJ, for its part, has maintained its policy rate at 0.5%, and we have provided significant US dollar and Jamaican dollar liquidity to the order of about 10% of GDP. The commercial banks, for their part, this is the private sector now, have granted loan moratoriums to individuals and businesses, right? And significantly, they have done that right across the board in the private sector. I just want to mention one other, not initiative, but contribution by the private sector, and that is in the form of remittances, where that has grown year over year by about nearly 30% for us here in Jamaica, and is making a contribution of nearly 5% of GDP to the ability of Jamaicans to consume. This is a very significant contribution that Jamaicans abroad are instinctively giving to the country and to the economy. And so that's what we have been trying to do here in Jamaica.
That's really impressive. Clearly a multifaceted effort by the government, by individuals, the diaspora. It's impressive to see. Peter, I'd love to hear your take. What do you think about the challenges that face emerging versus developed economies? How do we contrast the two?
Thank you for the question, Paula, and thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you and with Richard. And before I answer your question, let me just say that while this is a very challenging time, obviously, particularly for small countries like Jamaica, I think it's really important to remember that Jamaica's overcome some significant challenges prior to COVID. So Richard did a beautiful job of telling you the numbers. I won't repeat those numbers, but what Richard didn't mention that I would like to mention is that the transformation that took place in the Jamaican economy between 2013 and 2019, the turnaround pre-COVID, Richard played a central role in that, in his chairmanship of the Economic Policy Oversight Committee. And I think Jamaicans can take great heart from the fact that Richard played a central role in that, and he's now playing a central role in leading at the Bank of Jamaica. And I think Jamaicans can also take heart from the fact that what happened between 2013 and 2019 was unprecedented in Jamaican history, in the sense of having cooperation, in the sense of continuity of policy that Richard talked about across a change of regimes. And quite frankly, you mentioned my book, Paul, and when I wrote Turnaround in 2013, I was deeply skeptical of Jamaica's ability to transform itself. And I'm quite happy to be eating crow, so to speak, on that, because Jamaica has really turned itself around. So all that to say, under the leadership of successive parties, under Richard's leadership, and we now have some people who are in place in Jamaica who understand what it means to make tough decisions. And so I think people can take heart in that fact. And in particular, as Richard mentioned, there's fiscal space in Jamaica that would not have been there prior to the turnaround. So with that, let me just kind of segue a bit to the international economy, as you said, Paula. So it's a challenging moment for emerging economies. There's no question about it. And I would say issue number one, obviously, is public health, right? Until the public health situation is addressed from a global perspective, right? No one economy will be able to thrive in the way it would otherwise, right? So I think there's some lessons to be learned from East Asia, frankly, countries like South Korea, the way they've handled this crisis. And it's my sincere hope that with a change of leadership in the United States, there will be a systematic approach to public health. The Biden administration-elect has put out a detailed national health plan and has pledged to join the World Health Organization. So that international environment is going to be critical for small countries like Jamaica that are so dependent on the world economy. Richard mentioned debt. Debt is a very significant issue for a number of emerging economies. Frankly, the debt suspension, debt servicing suspension initiative that the IMF put forward in April is insufficient, and more will need to be done on that front. And one of the main challenges, in addition to public health and the debt situation, is going to just be, frankly, a full-throated commitment to continued trade and globalization from the biggest economies in the world. And that is not going to be easy to come by, because as we know, even prior to COVID, there's a real pushback against globalization. And so one of the major strategic challenges the world is facing right now, Paula, is this trade-off between, on the one hand, we've seen the need to be more resilient locally because of COVID, and we need to think very carefully about how do we create domestic supply chains that are sufficiently robust to the kinds of external shocks that we've seen. But on the other hand, there's a trade-off on efficiency. And we know from the last 30 plus years that more globalization, not less, is what emerging economies, particularly countries like Jamaica, need. So Jamaica can't do a heck of a lot, to be honest, because it's a small country in terms of pushing that debate. But we have to continue to speak with one voice with our partners in CARICOM and with other countries that are in a similar boat that need the global economy, and to advocate that this is the way forward. If you want to have a revived global economy, you need to have a continued commitment to trade and globalization. So those are how I see the big issues, and I'm sure we can get into some more detail as we go.
You raise such great points, Peter, some that we wrestle with even at my firm. And I hope that the trend towards resilience and away from just in time to just in case, and the trends towards nearshoring maybe ends up benefiting countries like Jamaica.
Well, I think it's an important point, Paula. So, as Richard knows, Richard turned crisis into opportunity in Jamaica in 2013, 2014 with EPOC. And so what can a country like Jamaica do given all the turbulence externally? You have to position yourself, right? And think about how do you turn those challenges into opportunities. I think you mentioned some possibilities there, Paula.
Fantastic. You also mentioned, Richard's example as, a tremendous leader, and reminding us of the dramatic growth that Jamaica has experienced and the dramatic transformation that Richard played a key role in. I think that reminds me of, often we have this dichotomy where we think, developing economies are often viewed as lagging developed economies, but I think there are certainly cases where they're actually leading. And one of the examples, Richard, I'd love for you to tell us more about is the Bank of Jamaica's initiative to introduce a digital currency as another means to facilitate financial inclusion through technology. I think that's groundbreaking. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about that initiative, as well as any impact that the pandemic might have.
Yeah, well, the CBDC, Central Bank Digital Currency, I'm very proud of it, and I hope that we can guide it to a very successful launch. Where we are now is in the preparatory stages, looking for and selecting technical partners to work with us. So we are in the very formative stages. But what is a CBDC? It's really cash that is digitized. So in the same way that cash is minted by the central bank and issued, it's the same way that we will create digital money and distribute it from the central bank into the commercial bank. So it's no different. The process and the distribution network is just like cash. And hopefully it will be used just like cash at the retail level. So there's no risk of inflation. We're not creating more money than we would have with cash. And digital currency is not interest bearing either. So there's no incremental creation of money or purchasing power. It's exactly what we meant. $1 Jamaican is all that it ever will be in circulation. As I said, it will go through the various commercial banks down into the business community and into the retail sector, and it will be transferable phone to phone or phone to any other device that can accept that kind of transfer. Now in Jamaica, telephones, cell phones are very prevalent. We have more than 2 per person. Something that we are, in a way, kind of proud of. So I think there's a good infrastructure reason to expect that digital currency will be successful and will be adopted by the ordinary man in the street. So what are the kind of advantages of it? Well, what it will do is aid in financial inclusion, because to have the use of digital currency, you have to become a bank account person. You have to open an account. And what we have done is pass legislation that gives banks more flexibility in how they can recruit customers. So if you're a small customer, the standards are low. If you're a big customer, the standards are higher. A digital currency should reduce the cost of payments considerably. The cost of handling cash is tremendous. I know what it costs the central bank to mint, hold, and distribute and refresh currency. It's a lot of money, and that goes right down the chain. Commercial banks, it costs them a lot to hold it, to exchange it, to have people that perform teller duties, to have ATMs. In the retail trade, the same thing, the cost of moving cash, protecting cash. So with a digital currency, most of those costs, if not all of those security type costs disappear. Handling type costs disappear also. So those are some of the advantages. It will also, very importantly, allow the government to connect more to the ordinary Jamaican. So in this COVID crisis, for example, in distributing social welfare, what we have found is that it's very hard to get those payments out to the hundreds of thousands of beneficiaries. They don't have bank accounts, hard to cash a check, they don't have identification. So once we recruit persons to be a CBDC account holder, in a snap of the finger, you can push money to them, you stay connected to them. So a CBDC has many advantages, and we're proud that we will be amongst the first in the world, but not the first in the Caribbean, to launch a central bank digital currency.
Will be a tremendous accomplishment and really helpful, as you said, to the ordinary Jamaican. I look forward to seeing that. And, you know, clearly the role of digital currency, which is separate, of course, from cryptocurrencies. These are all topics that are coming up much more frequently. Peter, how do you view the role of digital as well as cryptocurrencies in the economy going forward?
Let's think about what Richard just said, and I'd like to kind of broaden it actually and connect it to something that Richard said in his opening remarks. So one of the really important things for Jamaica moving forward, again, even pre-COVID, but now especially given COVID, Richard mentioned reducing the cost of doing business, right? So Jamaica's done some very hard, big macroeconomic reforms. And one of the key challenges now is to allow, as Richard put it, for the ordinary man or woman in the street, small businesses to operate efficiently at a relatively small scale. And so if you think about the digital currency initiative that Richard just talked about, that's a very important step in reducing the cost of just managing cash for businesses. But I think we need to think more generally, and I hope that those conversations will be taking place, and I suspect they are, and I'm sure Richard will probably be at the center of them. As we build out the digital infrastructure in Jamaica more broadly, not just related to currency, I think it's just very important that there be close conversation between business sector, who are obviously going to be pushing for their interests, and then folks in the government like Richard, whose job it is to sort of manage the tensions between businessmen who want to make money and want to push the envelope, so to speak, and the need for safety and soundness, managing privacy and all the issues that go along with that. But I think there's a real opportunity, right, to create a different kind of business environment, right? Because we know that Jamaica is not going to achieve 5% growth per year by becoming a major labor-intensive manufacturing hub. Right? That's not the way forward. But Jamaica has many other advantages, right? And so just let's take a tangible example. Just you mentioned nearshoring, Paula, right? So as we think about what have we learned during the COVID crisis? One of the things we've learned is we as a world, in certain kinds of professions that don't require actually face-to-face contact. So put aside restaurants, okay? There's some very specific people-to-people services that are going to continue to face challenges, right? Without public health. But we've learned that we can work remotely, right? We can do that. And I don't think that means that, you know, cities are going to disappear or that everyone's going to go into hibernation. But what it does mean is that people who have been working in very, very expensive places around the world, from New York to San Francisco to London, including, you know, many Jamaicans, but not all Jamaicans, right? In some of these places, are going to now say, you know what? I'm going to tell my boss that I can perform this work just as well by coming to the office, you know, 3 or 4 times a year. And I don't want to live, you know, with an incredibly high standard of living in a North American city. I want to actually live in Jamaica because it's got a higher quality of life. I can do my work from a warm environment, and I can work digitally. But where's the crux, right? You have to have the right digital infrastructure, the right digital, frankly, it's called digital culture, right? Mm-hmm. Ease of transferring payments, all those things. So my point here is just as we think strategically about the way forward for Jamaica, it's critical that all the players in this conversation, from businesses to the government sector, are thinking about these kinds of issues, and then broaden it from digital infrastructure to just more general infrastructure. I know there's conversation now in Jamaica about what's next with respect to roads, but electricity has to be part of that conversation as well too, right? So how do we create a 21st century infrastructure, digital, physical, and otherwise, to allow, to your very important point, Paula, Jamaica to compete where there are opportunities?
I completely agree. As a member of the diaspora working in New York City, if I had a seamless opportunity to spend a bulk of my time in Jamaica, I would seize it. And Richard, I'd love you perhaps off the couple of.
No Henry's listening to this.
He would support it. I'm sure.
He should support it.
He would. But I'd love for you, Richard, to react to that. You know, from the perspective of, I've always believed that there are some natural talents and the people in the country's location that are advantages for the country. And in this moment, how do we think about taking advantage of some of these opportunities? And, you know, you've taken the innovations you've put in place from the Bank of Jamaica, you know, almost responding to Peter's point. Are there other government policies or development projects or interrelations between yourself and the business sector that you think should be priorities to take advantage of some of these new opportunities?
Well, to get digital currency being really universally adopted and successful, just think of it. There's nothing more pervasive, omnipresent than cash. Every single Jamaican touches cash in one way or another. So if we want a digital currency to be very successful, it means that the infrastructure on which it runs has to be as available as putting your hand in your pocket and taking out cash. It must never fail, because you can always put your hand in your pocket and take out cash. So we have a vested interest in working with the government and the telecoms to try to make that infrastructure in Jamaica, which is imperfect at this time, but substantial nonetheless, to get that in better and better condition as we go along. And they are one of our major stakeholders in this digital currency initiative on our part, to tell us what it is that the government can do to help them to be in a state of readiness for the launch of the currency. Now, I should say that we have already been exploring, in a way, Jamaica nibbling at the edges of this digital world. If you think of all of our business process outsourcing operations that exist in Jamaica, I believe we employ somewhere in the region of 50,000 people, young people, in that business in Jamaica now. And that's a significant number of employed people for Jamaica, and particularly in that age group. So the opportunity to build education, to make it more relevant by directing it towards the objective of being digitally literate is a great development opportunity for us. And young people take to this digital world so quickly that I have no doubt that in the same way we are successful in athletics, successful in music, we will be as successful in this new digital world. We need to back it up with that telecom infrastructure and that education that can take kids from 10, 12 years old and really give them a good grounding in whatever subjects it takes to be digitally literate.
Such a great point, Richard. And I love that you've raised the point around digital literacy, because, I fundamentally believe that, the innovations you have put in place or are putting in place around digital currency will address, one of my next questions around inequality. But similarly, digital literacy and making sure our labor force, not just in Jamaica, but frankly, in the US and globally, that all of us are digitally literate so that we are prepared for the future of work has only become more important. And a question for you both related to this point then on inequality. Even prior to COVID, there were concerns about rising inequality within developed and developing countries, as well as between the two. Do you expect disparities between standards of living to improve or worsen in the post-COVID economy? And I direct that to both of you.
I'll jump in, Richard. Do you want to go first?
Well, I think yes, it is the answer. It will cause more inequality in Jamaica, as well as between Jamaica and other countries. In our experience in Jamaica is that, compared to what we hear happens in the United States, we have enormously less resources per capita to devote to social welfare. And that alone is going to make our poor be even poorer in comparison to the United States. So the less resources we have, and we don't have the ability to reach out to these people, as we spoke of before. I don't know how they do it in the United States, but they know where to find everybody pretty much, and they can deliver that social welfare check. For us, our success rate is probably more in the order of about 60%, or maybe even a little less, in hitting that target audience. We have a widening fiscal deficit now as a result of the drop in tax revenues, additional expenditure that we have to make towards health. And what that widening fiscal deficit is doing is reversing our debt to GDP ratio and removing from us that day, or distancing from us, I should say, that day when we will be able to devote more and more resources to capital projects to improve the infrastructure of Jamaica, the means for Jamaicans, hospitals, schools, roads, that kind of stuff. So it's setting us back, and I think it sets us back at least 2 years, and with these rains and everything else, it may be even a little bit more than that. I came across IMF piece of literature the other day where they say that, having studied several pandemics in the past, they have found that invariably it does create greater inequality between say, the top 10% of the population and the rest, and again between poorer countries and richer countries. So it seems to be a universal truth. One ironical point to make, though, and Peter alluded to this earlier, that in every challenge there is an opportunity. Jamaica has for many years lived on the idea that our labor is cheaper than labor elsewhere. And so in the 80s, we had this garment industry where we would stitch pre-cut garments together and ship it on again because the labor in Jamaica was cheaper to do that than to ship it straight to the United States or to manufacture it in the United States. Fast forward a bit, and those 50,000 people we spoke of a while ago as being in the business process outsourcing industry, they are the result of that disparity between our wage rates and those of the United States too. Even in tourism, we do have some natural advantages, of course, sun, sea, sand, but one of the big selling points for tourism in Jamaica is the cost of labor in the whole process of running a hotel is such that it is a distinct advantage for an investor to come here. So the point I'm making is a challenge can become an opportunity if you know what to make of it. It's the exact point that Peter had made a little earlier.
And just to build on what Richard was saying about inequality, I think he's absolutely right. This pandemic has really exacerbated things. I mean, here in the United States, we're seeing, what we're calling a K-shaped recovery. So to just be very tangible about it. So for people who work in let's call it sort of, I don't want to use the word high skilled, but sort of jobs that require a high level of education and a high level of sort of official bona fides, let's call it, right? People who work in jobs like you, though employment in high income sectors has come back pretty much to what it was pre-pandemic. If you're working in the restaurant industry, if you're in the United States, you make less than $60,000 a year, which sounds like a lot of money, but in the U.S., that's getting to the lower end of the scale. Employment is still down between 10 and 20% for folks in those groups, and that's a significant challenge. And that's a significant challenge for countries like Jamaica for the following reason. And even before COVID, there was this pushback against globalization because in rich countries like the United States, in Western Europe, there's been a widening of inequality and a real discontent from the point of view of the working class and those folks in manufacturing jobs who feel like they've not benefited from globalization. So on the one hand, you have this incredible story. So starting in 1995, roughly, from 1995, through 2018, 2019, emerging economies grew at 5.5% per year, roughly, which is far faster than they grew from 1980 to 1994, when they grew about 3.5% per year. So you had a 2 percentage point increase based on how fast these countries were growing, which means that lots of people are being lifted out of poverty. And this is not just a China and India story, okay? So the point being that emerging and developing economies, by following the kinds of policies that Richard drove in Jamaica through EPOC, Jamaica was late to the party, so to speak, but developing countries started doing this in the early 1990s, and as a result, experienced a tremendous increase in their growth. A country that grows by an additional 2 percentage points per year reduces the amount of time it takes to double the standard of living in that country by about 15 years. And so the ironic thing is that success in the emerging economies, as emerging economies have become more, I won't say self-sufficient, but more able to drive up their own standards of living by participating in the global economy, that is in jeopardy because advanced economies have done a very poor job of managing the inequality that Richard spoke about, right? And so we're in this very, very dangerous time, frankly, where there are gains to be had on both sides in the developing world and in the developed world from continued trade and globalization, but they'll only happen if we get serious policies in advanced economies to address the inequality, to therefore create more of a base, a political base, frankly, for policies that will benefit both developed and developing countries. So inequality is a major issue in advanced economies, and it's going to affect developing countries because it's undermining support for things like free trade, which are so critical for countries like Jamaica. But again, as Richard said, there are opportunities. I think it's one thing that's going to be quite critical. Richard talked about the importance of education. I couldn't agree more. But we've seen the unequal opportunities in education as a result of the digital divide during COVID, right? Some kids have laptops. Some kids don't even have a phone, right? And so the way in which these issues get addressed, and I saw a really kind of moving piece on a video that UNICEF put together a few weeks ago on what some people in Jamaica are doing to actually to get educational services out to rural communities. It was a very moving video about a young teacher in Kingston who has an outdoor blackboard. You know, people are doing very sort of ingenious things, but we have to find a way to make this systematic. And again, this is going to require, I think it's going to require the use of digitization, and it's going to require partnership between the civil sector, government, and the private sector.
I certainly agree with you both, especially on the importance of education. When we look at the similar data, especially for the US, the disproportionate job loss has impacted those without a college degree, right? So to your point, Peter, so education is key to think about rectifying that going forward. The question I have, which is outstanding, and I don't know that we can answer it on this call, is to the extent that those with a college degree or in more professional job categories have not yet experienced the same job loss. That's true to date. But to what extent is that going to continue to be true over the next 4 to 6 months? Because historically, once you've had the type of contraction and economic growth that we've seen this year, job losses in the financial sectors, et cetera, tend to follow. So that's my big, open question on whether we actually will see this end up impacting some of the higher earners as well. But related to that, and maybe shifting topics just a little bit, you mentioned this, Peter.
Just quickly on that.
Oh, you want to please respond?
Just quickly in a U.S. context, this is now critical. Where, segueing from folks like Richard who run central banks to policy to legislators, right? Legislators have to basically take the baton at this point. So the Federal Reserve of the United States has done all it can to put kind of a safety net in place and to keep financial markets functioning. But to your point, if we don't get an additional relief package in Congress in the United States in the new year, we should have had one already. We haven't had one. If we don't get a serious public health plan, then to the extent that lower income earners are continue to be hurt, the financial sector will be hurt, because you think about credit cards, you think about credit default, right? These things are going to become much more significant if we don't get a more uniform recovery. So your point is really well taken, Paula, where the high income earners are not immune, right? And we've got to address public health, and we've got to get relief to people. Harder to do in a country like Jamaica, where there's as Richard pointed out, there are less resources per capita to do that. But creative thinking needs to prevail.
Agreed. And it relates to your point about interrelation, which actually leads into my next question for you both, which is with regard to COVID-19, we've seen a diversity of responses by countries around the world. From the examples we've seen from Asian countries who enacted pretty strict measures to approaches taken by Sweden or the US. And early on, as Richard mentioned, those with pretty strict measures in place, including Jamaica, were very successful in containing the disease. But as of November, we are seeing a surge in cases globally. So what implications does this have for ongoing recovery efforts in Jamaica? Are there any lessons that the rest of the world can take from countries like Jamaica, both in managing the health as well as the economic crisis? Would love to hear both of your thoughts. And maybe I'll sprinkle on one other layer, which is the question you raised, Peter, about globalization, right? Now that more and more countries are looking inwards, whereas the demands of the day maybe require us to think in a more integrated manner, how do we manage that? And I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on that question.
So Peter, it's your time to go first.
Okay. I think it's a very important question, Paul. I would say this. I mean, I think the number one lesson is focus on public health and be vigilant and don't back away. Right. So you mentioned, I mean, the United States has been a disaster, frankly. I mean, let's just call it what it is. I mean, the cases here are now higher than they were back in what we thought was the height of the pandemic in March and April, right? We've turned it. It's become a political issue in the United States because, frankly, of a lack of leadership at the highest level in this country, and we need to change course. If we don't change course, we're going to continue to suffer the consequences of it. You mentioned, South Korea, New Zealand, other countries have dealt with this very differently. Jamaica was doing quite well. I mean, I can speak bluntly because I'm a concerned Jamaican speaking from afar. I mean, I'll just be blunt. I think the election was handled poorly from a public health point of view, and I haven't run the data very carefully, but it seems to be a pretty high correlation between the timing of the election and the uptick in cases. So the question is, what do you do moving forward? And I think the answer is, be more vigilant, recognize you can't let up on this thing. Particularly, there was good news this week. It seems as though the vaccine trials at Pfizer are promising, but we're a long way away from actually having the vaccine. And coming back to Richard's important points about the digital economy, it's not just currency, it's identification, right? Getting people registered, figuring out how, when you do have a vaccine, how are you going to efficiently reach people? And how are you going to distribute it? These are all things that the thinking needs to be happening now, right? As part of an integrated digital conversation, right? So vigilance is sort of the strategic kind of frame you have to have. But then as you implement it tactically, thinking about how to use the digital economy, digital technology to do that. And thinking about, again, not just distribution of vaccines, because we're not to vaccines yet, but just thinking about how do you use the information you have to combat public health even more, to combat the crisis even more efficiently, right? So we're beyond testing and tracing in most places at this point, but certainly there are things that we can do to share information more efficiently about where cases are spiking, and to just monitor behavior and treatment to actually implement a more vigilant, consistent, persistent strategy until such time that we do have a vaccine, because it's not coming to save us tomorrow.
No.
Yeah, agreed. In Jamaica, I think we have sought to find a balance between preserving lives but maintaining livelihood. So I guess if you said that the world had two models at the extreme, one kind of laissez-faire, where anything pretty much goes, but it's accompanied by a massive social assistance program, and then on the other hand, you have a version where everything is locked down very tightly and business continuity is sacrificed. We walk somewhere in between that. And I think we have done a pretty good job of it. That's what the results seem to show. Some of the initiatives that we have taken is we closed our borders pretty early. And for us, that's a very significant step. As you know, tourism is a big part of our well-being. So closing the borders, big step, and we did it early. And I think that helped quite a lot. Curfews, that's another kind of Jamaican option that we have exercised. So in Jamaica, we're accustomed to curfews when it comes to crime, but we use that same technique now to do with COVID, and we found that where there are specific geographical areas that have had outbreaks and spikes, we've been able to curfew that, and once it has settled off, then to open up back those borders. Social distancing, I think we have had a good campaign about social distancing to close down entertainment in Jamaica, no parties. That's another big step, and we have prosecuted that pretty resolutely here in Jamaica. Work from home orders. Government has been pretty taking a good initiative in that respect and been pretty strict about it. People over a certain age must stay home. In any workplace, X% should stay home, and the rest can go to office. So we've had a lot of that. And at BOJ, for example, from March, we've had work from home, and anywhere between a third to a half of our employees work from home and have done so from March. And we haven't found that it's been a fall off in productivity at all. So those initiatives have been pretty successful for us. We had a period where we did have a spike, and that's when a lot of Jamaicans who worked abroad had to come home. All those people who worked on cruise ships, and there are lots of Jamaicans that work on cruise ships, work in hotels abroad, they had to come home. And when they came back, we saw a spike in our COVID cases. But these are, by the way, the same members of the diaspora that have been remitting all of this to us. So, we take the spike and we'll manage that because the remittances have been tremendously helpful to us. So we have normalized now, and I think that we are heading into a period where the government is even considering loosening up a little bit over the Christmas period and allowing a little bit more social interfacing. So I think we have done a pretty good job on it.
Excellent. Peter, did you want to respond?
No, I would just say I think that Richard's right. You have to find a balance. The only thing I would add is that when one of the things that we see, I think it's to keep in mind because we see it in the data, certainly in the U.S., is that even before we went into lockdown, in the restaurant business, in the airline business, in industries that really required the economic interaction to be kind of person to person, close up, business really tanked before lockdown, which suggests that part of what has to happen in order for those businesses to come back is a restoration of public confidence. So whereas I agree that there has to be a balance, I just think you can't overstate the importance of public health. And I think one of the lessons you learn if you look at, for instance, Germany and Europe more broadly, half of my family is in Germany at the moment. I have a son who's a very good soccer player, and I teach at NYU Berlin. But Germany was doing very well for a while, and then people sort of fell asleep a bit. Mm-hmm. And the numbers came back up. And Angela Merkel's done a great job, and they're tightening down again. But I think one of the bigger lessons here is if you take the pain early and figure out how to really put in place safeguards, then you can actually manage this thing, right? So for instance, I mean, it's too late to do things all over again, right? But where the fiscal space exists, and I think for developing countries, institutions like the IMF, the World Bank will have to play a role in this, You pay people to stay at home, right? And now that doesn't solve the problem that Richard mentioned, which is that, you know, there's some kinds of employment where even if you're paying employers to keep people on the job, if people are not actually coming physically to work in certain kinds of work, you're losing skills, right? That's not true for all jobs, but there are some jobs that are like that. So paying people to stay home doesn't necessarily solve that problem. But if you pay people to stay home, you can, and for a significant period of time, you can actually really get your cases down without having to have the kind of social tension around, you know, lockdown or economic survival. So I think there have been some lessons that we're going to probably need to apply again, because we're getting a redo of March, to be blunt about it.
I completely agree. And just to add to that, in addition to public confidence, I think, you know, the need for accurate health information, right? Because
Yes.
you can have public confidence and misinformation, and that has led us down a pretty bad path. And, you know, I have found that it's important, as, you know, you rightly said, Peter, even though there are great advancements in both treatments and in the vaccine that we've heard about this week, we probably won't have mass distribution for another 6 months.
So Paul, you raise a really good point that I'd love to just kind of come. I'm not. Just to be clear, Richard is not giving me any seniorage for saying these nice things about him, but I think it's important to point these out. So leadership really matters here, right? So if you think about it, back during March, when we were in the early days of the crisis, there was this misinformation about the role of masks. It's common knowledge that masks really reduce the transmission, right? And that was not made at all clear in the beginning of this crisis. In fact, we governments, frankly, here in the United States, saying, you don't need a mask. We still have government officials not wearing masks, right? Misinformation on the part of leadership is deadly, right? Trust in leadership builds confidence and can drive everything from economic recovery to health recovery. And so the kind of leadership that Jamaica experienced, during that really difficult period through epoch, through successive governments, that kind of solidarity, if you will, talking straight with people. And I think the government's done a good job, to Richard's point, by and large, in Jamaica on this. Communication's been pretty good. But I think you have to just be vigilant and not let up. There have been a couple of periods of time where I think people have eased up. And this illness, this disease, just takes over very quickly. I'm going to be quiet.
Thank you for that. What'd you say, Peter?
I'm going to be quiet now. I've been preaching.
No, please don't. This is great. But to piggyback, Richard, you outlined a multifaceted, comprehensive plan that the government of Jamaica put in place, from monetary stimulus, fiscal stimulus, and the like. And you outlined a number of sort of sub-bullet points beneath those two. Looking forward then, what do you think is the path forward subsequent to all of this sort of unprecedented economic support being created, not only by the Jamaican government, but by governments globally? We sort of learned from the GFC. What do you think the path forward is then past the stimulus?
You mean to develop the country? Yeah.
Yes, to improve economic growth,
Right.
address perhaps the health crisis.
Yeah, so I think, speaking specifically for Jamaica, the retention of macroeconomic stability is going to be a cornerstone for us. We can't avoid it. We have to maintain that. So issues of getting that debt to GDP back on a downward trajectory, keeping inflation low and stable, making sure the financial sector is strong and stable, and pursuing remaining structural reforms like independent central bank. And by the way, the minister has laid in Parliament the concept of a independent central bank to be debated next couple of weeks coming. The development of a fiscal council, yes, development of a fiscal council, that is in the making also, and the minister intends to lay that in Parliament, perhaps early next year. So these big structural reforms are going to continue for us. So the exact path that we were on before, which Peter referred to as enduring between administrations. So that path started in 2013. Despite the change of governments, we stayed on that path. It's the same path that we want to continue as we try to emerge out of this COVID crisis. Beyond that, though, I think there are some development issues that we must pay more attention to. I would like to see us really commit to a 10-year plan. I say 10 because some of the things we have to do are pretty fundamental. And that plan would try to jumpstart our economic transformation. I didn't say just growth, and I didn't say just development. I said transformation. A little earlier, Peter spoke about Jamaica not continuing on this path of what amounts to really low labor productivity, therefore low value added, cheap labor type of economic development. It employs people, yes, and that is crucial. Don't mistake me on that. Somebody earning a small wage is better than someone earning no wage, but it's not good enough for the future. And what we need to do is to start to build the foundation for Jamaicans to each deliver more value added in the jobs that they do. And that means that we have to go right back to education and start to build those youngsters in school to have the skills of the future so that when they emerge, A, there's a job out there for them and they don't just sit and wait for an opportunity, but B, that they can make a contribution that earns them more, earns the country more, and therefore we can retain more of what we earn. We have industries where if a dollar is earned, we only in Jamaica retain 15 cents in a dollar. That's not good enough for us. We need to retain a whole lot more for Jamaica to really develop. So apart from that foundation stone of education, I want to see us also look at developing our digital infrastructure. Jamaica needs to become, certainly starting with government, totally digitized. You need to be able to stay right in your home office, pay every government tax you have to pay, apply for every license that you need to apply for, do everything without moving. That is such a facility that is attractive to people that I have no doubt that alone will bring investors to the table for Jamaica. We can't in Jamaica develop without also developing agriculture, but it has to be an agriculture that technology is applied to. We can't keep having drought and flood ruin a year's work for us in agriculture, keep our productivity low. We have to apply technology, science to agriculture to make it more durable and to make it more productive. And I think finally, we have to conquer our little crime problem. So in this 10-year plan, that I think we need to use the opportunity of the challenge of COVID to huddle and to say, okay, we are going to start doing what will be a success in 10 years' time. Let us lay those foundation stones and build on them every year. To step back for a minute to Peter's constant referral to the IMF program in 2013. Of all the programs we have ever had with the IMF, and we have had 30-odd programs since our independence in 1962, that program in 2013 is the one that we should have failed at. But we failed at many others before, but the one that we should have failed at, we didn't. And we didn't for a number of reasons. One of them, of course, was absolute determination. Our backs were against the wall, and we had to perform. And that is when leadership really blossomed. And I'm not speaking of myself, I'm speaking of leadership in the political system and leadership in the private sector, leadership in society general. Everybody kind of put their shoulder behind the wheel. I think we can do the same thing with this 10-year plan. Let's commit to it. Let's lay out quarterly milestones that we need to hit to achieve this 10-year objective, so that we know at every point along the way we are on track because we have achieved these milestones. I mean, I would be terribly excited to participate in the development of that plan and the working of that plan.
I'm excited.
Excited too. Can I jump in, Paul?
I'm in.
I think Richard said it really well. And all I would like to add is just to sort of connect what Richard said of what needs to happen in Jamaica internally to the external opportunity. So Richard's absolutely right that the key to being a high standard of living economy is not to be a low wage economy, but to be a low cost economy. And you can be a high wage and low cost economy if productivity is high, which is the point Richard was making about value added, right? But the way, how do you drive it? As you said, education, but also the cost of doing business, which is everything from regulation to infrastructure. So let's talk about infrastructure for a second. And that's connected to the global picture. One of the biggest untapped opportunities facing the world right now is the following. For at least a decade plus, everybody from Ben Bernanke to Janet Yellen to other central bank governors have talked about the global savings glut, which basically means we've had a lot of savings and relatively little real investment. Not talking about 401k plans, I'm talking about investment in capital. Okay, and what that means, that's the reason why we have record low interest rates, even before the COVID crisis, right? That exists at the same time we have massive undercapitalization in infrastructure throughout the developing world, Jamaica included. Okay, so the biggest infrastructure opportunities for the world exist in the big developing countries, okay? But Jamaica can participate in that, in the following sense, right? So if the world is going to actually get back to rapid growth and get out of this global savings glut, low interest rate environment, it's going to have to find a way to match basically savings that's sitting in US Treasury bills to, for instance, the fact that Nigeria's labor force is growing almost 3% per year, and it has 200 million people. Nigeria has all kinds of problems, but if you don't figure out Nigeria, Pakistan, Indonesia, right, to figure out a way to get the savings from US Treasury bills into high potential return infrastructure projects, roads, electricity, et cetera, in the developing world, we're not going to see a return to high growth. So all that to say is, I know that some of the folks at your firm, Paul, and elsewhere are working on this problem. Like, how do we solve this infrastructure financing problem, right? Because it's complicated, but something Richard said is crucial to this. You need stability and predictability. So if Jamaica could commit to a market-based, right, approach that says, okay, here's a 10-year vision for Jamaica. And at the center of that vision is harnessing markets to improve the productive and capacity and earning power of the people. Not by doing kind of one-off special deals, with free economic zones or tax havens. We've tried that before. It doesn't work. The way to do it is to create a productive, low-cost business operating environment that Richard so eloquently outlined, right? If on top of that you say, okay, let's identify where do we truly have high social return investments in infrastructure, everything from roads to electricity to water supply, right? And this requires real hard thinking. It's not just, what Richard and I happen to think, oh, we know a man who, has a farm in St. Elizabeth and right. We're talking about systematic looking at the data to understand where there really are public goods, right? Because the infrastructure is a public good. The government's going to have to sort of, fill in that gap. But if the returns are really there in terms of generating, incremental impact on GDP, then over time that's going to be sustainable because you can actually raise the tax revenue to fund that. But again, that's going to require continuity across regimes, right? Because you don't know who's going to be in power 10 years from now. And so how do you create the kind of partnership and commitment to policies that that were driven under EPOC, right? That allows you to bridge two different parties. If you could create that kind of confidence and discipline to a long-run vision where foreign investors, the KKRs and the Blackstones of the world, can say, okay, Jamaica's got a government that's committed to this path. We don't know who's going to be prime minister. We don't know which party can be in power. And I don't know how you create those commitment devices. But to Richard's point, it's essential because now is the time, given low growth, low interest rates in the developed world, for countries like Jamaica, even though Jamaica's small potatoes, frankly, compared to Nigeria. But the good news in that, again, to Richard's point about opportunity, you don't need a heck of a lot of money from the point of view of the global investment pool, right? Just a fraction of that could do a world of good in Jamaica. So, but it takes vision and I think most importantly, it's going to take discipline and commitment and figuring out some way to basically tie both parties' hands to the kind of massive economic discipline going forward.
Brilliant points for both of you. And I agree wholeheartedly, particularly in this low yield environment where investors are, flying to quality. The proximity of Jamaica, the sort of the infrastructure from a business and a central bank perspective that you've established, Richard, I think it should be a tremendous opportunity for Jamaica. I could talk to you both, I think, for hours. This has been a ton of fun. I would, though, like to close for everyone else. We can continue our conversation. If you had, final remarks. I feel so full from this conversation on this topic of, how we return to sort of pre-COVID levels of transformation. So not just growth. You've said a ton already, but if there are any final remarks, I'd love to conclude there.
Yeah, I'll be brief because I don't want to repeat myself, but here is what's the truth. This crisis will take a severe toll on Jamaica and every country, but particularly on countries like Jamaica. There's no doubt about that. But there is opportunity in the crisis, and we need to seize that opportunity. And what it really boils down to is this digitization. Because what it does is that it levels the playing field. A little Jamaican boy who is 15 years old today, coming from St. Elizabeth, Peter, with the right training, education right up, and that education can be world-class now, if we want, because he can get it on a tablet, and it can be delivered by Peter himself. That can be part of his education. So he has the opportunity to be on a level playing field with every other 15-year-old kid in the world. And when he gets to 25 and he's fully trained, he's going to be a new Jamaican that is going to contribute tremendously more than his parents ever did. And that is the kind of opportunity that we need to look forward to. The day when we can create that kind of new Jamaica.
I think Richard said it really well. All I would add to Richard's vision is if you think about what is it that allows governments, leadership to deliver on the kind of vision that Richard articulated. And it's really three things. It's discipline, clarity, and trust, right? Discipline means a sustained commitment to a pragmatic growth strategy, right? Clarity, countries turn around when governments demonstrate a clear commitment to a change of direction towards that new strategy, executed with discipline. And when you have discipline, you have clarity, people trust you. And if people trust you, they're going to follow you, right? And so I think we were learning those lessons of discipline, clarity, and trust and seeing the benefits through 2019. So what I would say is don't lose hope. I think Richard said it very well. We're facing tough times, but the role of leaders is to define clarity and give hope, define reality and give hope. So I hope that I know that Richard will continue to do that in his role. I hope that our leaders in the political sector will remember that and continue to do that as well.
Thank you for that. And to close, we are certainly in tough times, but I feel comforted that someone like Richard is in the leadership role he's in, and that, Peter, we get to speak with you and hear your insights from Stern. You both have shared, insightful remarks on economic priorities and the need for strategic, sustainable, long-term plans in thinking about economic development in the future. On behalf of the AFJ, we certainly look forward to partnering with you and are really grateful that, such esteemed leaders have taken the time to have this conversation with us. And with that, thank you.
It's been a pleasure, Paula. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too, Richard.